In prior chapters, we've discussed the idea that the world is changing and therefore our mindset needs to change, and then we'll need to develop new skills. So here we'll discover that design thinking is a tool for facilitating that mindset shift, enabling us to see opportunities and possibilities that we had never seen before. Here in this chapter, I'll give you an overview of the entire design thinking process, and in the subsequent chapters, we'll break it down step by step in more detail. I'm going to start off with a story from Stanford University, which is where design thinking became famous. At Stanford, there's a graduate program called the D School, D standing, of course, for design. And it's here that the method of design thinking was really perfected. The D School is a graduate program, but it doesn't issue its own degrees. Its students come from all the rest of the graduate programs of the university. D School students come from the law school, the business school, the engineering schools, many of the science disciplines, as well as the humanities. And so they're participating as multidisciplinary teams, learning this technique of design thinking, which then they very often apply back in their other discipline studies. So the story that I'm sharing with you was shared with me by one of our colleagues, Michael Berry, who is a professor at the D School. And Michael told me the story this way. Every year, the students at the D School take on a project which is based on requests from various organizations around the world. So the story that I'm going to share with you was based on a request from the government of India. What the government observed is that the rate of death of prematurely born babies was quite high, and so they felt that they needed more incubators in their hospitals. However, incubators are very expensive, and so what the government of India was asking for was a redesign of their incubators such that they could provide many more of them at a very low cost. So, of course, the team of students went to India and they visited many hospitals and they talked with doctors and with families. And during the course of their research, of course, they took many, many pictures. So they observed incubators like this one, and they began to study the design characteristics of the incubators. And in various hospitals that they visited, they saw different types of incubators, and they talked with more people and took more photographs. And after they'd been in India for a few weeks, they returned back to Stanford, printed out their pictures, and they put them up on the wall so they could study them and look for patterns. So you can see there are quite a number of different types of incubators. Some seem quite high-tech, some are low-tech, some are made for babies which are quite ill and need a lot of care, perhaps in intensive care. Others are simply baby warmers. These are not the actual photos that the students took, but this is what the photos showed. So they looked at the design of the covering, of the holes through which the nurse or the family would put their hands, the electronic controls, the power supplies, all the technical as well as the usability aspects of the incubators. And after a while, one of the students happened to notice something, and they realized that something was missing. Did you notice what was missing? Well, all of the photographs of the incubators that we were looking at didn't have a baby in them. And this led the students to realize that they had been visiting hospitals and they'd seen many, many incubators without babies. And this led them to the realization that, in fact, perhaps the problem wasn't a lack of incubators in hospitals, but a lack of incubators for babies who are not born in hospitals. Rural Indians don't have access to much healthcare. They may never visit a hospital during their entire lives. And so perhaps the students realized the government of India had actually given them the wrong problem to solve. Maybe the problem wasn't incubators in hospitals, but incubators for babies who were born not in hospitals, who were born in clinics or born in homes. And this led the students to invent a sleeping bag for babies. And the design proved to be so successful that the students decided to found their own nonprofit organization, which, as you can see here, they call Embrace. And so Embrace baby warmers have been used to incubate hundreds of thousands of babies in India and in many other countries. And of course, the cost of the Embrace incubator is about $20, whereas the cost of a hospital incubator could be $10,000 or $20,000. So this proved to be a very cost-effective solution. So what this story embodies for us is the idea that design thinking is a shift. It's a shift of perspective. It's a shift of awareness. It's a shift of perception, a process that enables us to see the world in new ways. And of course, that's the very foundation of innovation. What is the basis of innovation? It's seeing a new need. It's seeing a new possibility. It's seeing how to apply a new technology. So design thinking at the origin of this process, at the moment of discovery of inspiration, is a powerful tool that frees us from our previous ideas and assumptions. So here's a photo of a prematurely born baby in an Embrace incubator, one of hundreds of thousands of babies. Embrace has gone on to develop products for the Western developed world, and they're able to use the profits from these products to subsidize baby warmers that are provided to the less developed parts of the world. So it's important to emphasize that the core of design thinking is that it's a process to facilitate us, to enable us, to inspire us to see differently. So now let's take another example, a quite different example. Of course, you've seen FedEx trucks and airplanes. There are very small ones, there are very large ones. You see them on the city streets everywhere you go. But did you ever notice the hidden symbol in the FedEx logo? It's been there for about 25 years, and it's there because it conveys an important message to FedEx customers. It says, this is what our business is about. So if you haven't ever seen the symbol, take a look at the logo on the side of this truck and see if it jumps out at you. Well, I'll make it a little simpler for you. I'll tell you which letters to look at. And now, if you haven't seen it before, you've seen it now, and you'll never, ever be able to not see it again. So this is also an example of the shift of thinking. Of course, this is a metaphor. This isn't a literal shift of thinking, but it expresses the idea that when we change our perspective, we can see the world differently. And when we see the world differently, we can discover things that may be valuable to us. There's the FedEx truck. There's the arrow on the side of the FedEx truck. The arrow, of course, conveys the message, yes, we get your package there fast. We deliver it straight to its destination. And this, of course, is the brand identity of FedEx. So the arrow and the brand identity are one. And yet FedEx has never called attention to the arrow. It's there as a quiet, perhaps subliminal message about the brand value proposition of the company. There's also an arrow hidden in the Amazon logo. Well, actually, the arrow isn't hidden, but what does it connect? Well, it connects A to Z because Amazon carries every product from A to Z. Again, companies using metaphors to convey a message, and the metaphor for us also represents this notion of a shift in our perspective. So it turns out that label and brand designers have been embedding hidden symbols in their logos for a long, long time. You can Google hidden symbols in brands and you'll find web page after web page with many fascinating examples. This is one of my favorite. Black cat. Did you notice the eyes of the black cat looking at you? Here's another one. This is a map. It looks like a map of Australia, and of course it is. And what does it represent? Well, it's the logo for Yoga Australia. Brilliantly done logo, which again conveys this message of a hidden meaning and reminds us that to see what's hidden, we have to see differently. So this is the essence of design thinking. And it's a shift of thinking, as we saw, the shift of thinking from understanding the problem as needing more incubators to understanding the problem as we need incubators that are very inexpensive and are used not in hospitals. This shows all of the Nokia products that were made in the fourth quarter of 2007. This was a publicity image that Nokia used to show the breadth and depth of its product line. And of course, what do all these products have in common? Well, they have some form of a keyboard. And what other product was introduced around the end of 2007, which didn't have a keyboard, but which changed the way we all think about telephones? Well, of course, that was the iPhone. So the shift that Nokia didn't understand and which Apple had discovered was that keys were no longer necessary for a phone. Of course, the shift from taxis to Uber represents a shift of perspective, a shift of capability, and a shift of how we think about getting around in the city. This is an airplane wing, and this is the way all airplane wings were designed for many decades. But have you noticed that airplane wings now have a little upturn on the end? It's called a winglet. Well, why would the aircraft engineers make this change? And what might have inspired them to do this? The inspiration for this innovation came from observations of birds, because nearly all birds have some form of winglets at the end of their wings. It's a shift of thinking inspired by nature, a field of study called biomimicry. Here's another example of biomimicry. This is a bird which is called a kingfisher. It was the specific inspiration for the front of the bullet train, which is very aerodynamically efficient, just as the kingfisher's beak is hydrodynamically efficient. It enables it to dive into the water to catch fish for its lunch and dinner. Here's another example of a shift of thinking of a quite different nature. You can see these children are playing, they're playing on a merry-go-round. But the merry-go-round also has an important purpose in their community. Can you see what it is from this picture? What are these children doing? Well, they're providing the power to pump water from deep under the ground into this water tank. It's a brilliant innovation which combines two very, very different devices. One, the energy of children turning a merry-go-round for fun, and the other, the need for powerful pumping to pull water out of the ground and put it into a tall tower. So this was an invention by an organization which is called Play Pumps, and they raise money now and install play pumps all over Africa to provide fresh water for communities that don't have it. Can you see how this is also a shift of thinking? A shift very much like the shift of thinking in the Embrace baby warmer, taking two different elements and putting them together in a very unexpected way to yield a very fine design result. So how do we do design thinking? Is there a process? Is there a technique? Is there a method? And in fact, of course, there is. We describe design thinking as a process which has three major steps, and each of the major steps has two sub-steps. We begin with the notion that we have to immerse ourselves to capture information from the environment. We need to understand what's going on, and then we want to map our discoveries. In the example from the D School, the students went to India to understand the context of baby incubators and to understand the context of the Indian culture and the Indian healthcare system. And when they came back and they began to study the photographs and they did the mapping process, this is when they had the insight, the discovery, that in fact the problem as it had been formulated was probably not the right problem. So all design thinking activities begin with some form of immersion, some technique or techniques for immersing ourselves in the environment to discover new information. Now, in the following chapter, we'll look in more depth at various techniques that you can apply to immerse yourself in the issues and problems that are relevant to your innovations. The second phase of design thinking is called invent. This is when we come up with concepts and ideas that may prove to be solutions to the problems that we've discovered. So in our D School example, the students defined that the problem was not in fact a cheaper incubator for a hospital, but a very inexpensive incubator that could be easily transported and used in the countryside. And this then led them into the ideation phase, where the idea of the baby sleeping bag emerged as a possible solution to the problem. But in order to verify that in fact it was a solution, the students had to go through a phase of implementation, during which they developed many prototypes, and then they tested the best prototypes to discover if their design would in fact work. So here the goal is to create working solutions that can actually be tested, and then using those prototypes to actually gain specific user feedback. So here's another way to visualize the process. We can see it as a cycle with immersion at the beginning, invention in the middle, and implementation at the end. And of course, the red arrow represents the idea that it's not a linear process, but a looping process, a learning process where discoveries that we make in any one of these phases may impact on the other phases. And the arrow that leads from implementation to immersion suggests that once we come up with prototypes and test them, then we may in fact be starting the process all over again. Because in user testing, what are we doing? Well, we're immersing ourselves again in understanding. And this may lead us to new maps, to new ideas, and therefore to new prototypes. And this is the iterative process of product development and refinement. One of the important insights about design thinking is that it gives us a structured guideline for how to pursue innovation in a disciplined and rigorous manner. And one of the important notions about design thinking is to understand that if we don't follow the process with some rigor, then we're very likely to end up with solutions which are not nearly as innovative as they could or should be. So it is not uncommon in organizations that the understand phase, the define phase, the prototype and user testing phases are skipped entirely, and we go immediately to defining the problem and then ideating around what we think the problem is. So the simplified version of design thinking, which never ever works, so don't do this, is map to ideate to implement. This may appear to be a faster approach, but it often results in poor products that don't reflect a deep understanding of true customer needs and are therefore unsuccessful in the marketplace. So now let's go back to the iPhone and ask the question, how did Apple know that it would be a success? When all the Nokia phones had keys, what gave Apple the courage and confidence to know that users would be comfortable with the touch screen? Well, they had to get the evidence. And what was the evidence for Apple? Well, it was their own testing process. So here's a picture of the product, which was the precursor of the iPhone, the iPod. And during the development of the iPod, one of the main goals of the software engineers was to make the interface as simple as possible. And in order to achieve this, they went through many iterations of the interface design. In fact, during one phase of the design, they reported that they did another version of the software every day. So they would demo it, they would get the feedback, they would revise the demo, get more feedback, etc. Maybe hundreds and hundreds of cycles of design. So this is how they manage the design process within the design team. And Apple's management has historically paid so much attention to product design that Mondays at Apple are called review day, because every Monday the senior executives review all of the new products which are under development. This level of attention to product design is one of the reasons that Apple's products are so successful all over the world, and one of the reasons that the company is now one of the most valuable in the world. Another perspective on Apple's approach to product design is this comment from Johnny Ive, who is the head of design at Apple. He says, one of the hallmarks of our team is inquisitiveness or curiosity, the desire and the interest to learn more. He says, we get excited about being wrong because it means we've discovered new things. And of course, this is exactly what we're trying to achieve in a rapid process of prototyping and design iteration, because we test and we learn what didn't work, and then we redesign in order to try to solve that problem. And by doing this on a constant and iterative basis, we achieve massive improvements in the design of our products. So in fact, what we're describing here is a learning mindset, and a learning mindset is exactly the core of the design thinking process. Now, when the iPhone first came out, it had many critics. Many executives from other technology companies didn't think that the iPhone was going to be successful. The CEO of Palm, a company which doesn't exist anymore, said, quote, the PC guys are not going to be the ones to figure this out. The head of strategy at Nokia said, well, Apple was a niche supplier with a Mac, and they'll be a niche manufacturer in the phone business too. The CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, said, well, $500 is an awful lot to pay for a device that doesn't even have a keyboard. And the CEO of RIM, which made the BlackBerry, said, well, it's not really a big deal for us. It won't have a lot of impact on the BlackBerry market. And of course, the point is that all of these executives were dead wrong. And they were wrong because they hadn't taken the time to learn, to study, to understand. They hadn't done the immersion that Apple had done. And so they didn't understand how the product could function or what value it would provide to users. What they demonstrated, in fact, was not a learning mindset. What they didn't understand at the time, but of course they understand it now, is that the iPhone represents a fundamental shift in how we use telephones. So we hear comments like this all the time in the innovation process. Well, we tried that already. No one would buy that. Are you kidding me? That's too expensive. We can't make that technology work, and that's not what our customers want. The PC guys are not going to figure this out. The screen's too small. It doesn't have a keyboard. People want their own music, blah, 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 blah. Well, this is the not a learning mindset as well. And so when we're engaged in the design process and when we're engaged in design thinking, we want to have exactly the opposite mindset. The goal is to have the learning mindset, to immerse ourselves in order to discover what no one else has learned yet. Now, how does design thinking relate to the stage gate model or to the innovation funnel that we discussed in the prior chapter? Well, we can see here that in fact, phase 1 learning and discovery research and phase 2 targeted research can both apply the design thinking technique very, very effectively. In the case of stage 1, we might use design thinking in a very open-ended way, simply as a way to discover what's going on in the market, to explore what our customers are doing, to explore what they're thinking and how they're working. Whereas in stage 2, in targeted research, we might again apply design thinking, but in a much more focused manner. So we can think of stage 1 as the early stages of product discovery and conceptualization, whereas in stage 2, we would be looking at the design thinking method as a technique for product definition and refinement. But again, the core steps are going to be the same: immerse, invent, implement in a cyclical process pursued iteratively, leading us to deeper and deeper discoveries and higher performance. And we have to remember again that design thinking is not a linear process. Just as the stage gate is not linear, design thinking is not linear, and it's that iterative loop of learning, which is how we achieve the highest quality and the deepest understanding, and therefore the best results for our innovation process. But we can offer a few guidelines for the design thinking process. When we're involved in the invent stage and we're ideating, we want to come up with as many ideas as possible. So it's important that we defer judgment, that we simply accumulate ideas and possibilities without trying to choose the best one in the early stage. This is a process where we build upon the ideas of others. We take ideas that we hear and we add on other features and possibilities, and we have a rapid fire discussion about we could do this and we could do this and we could add that and we could add that, because more ideas is better. In this phase of the process, the more ideas we have, the more likely we'll end up with a great idea, and therefore wild ideas are welcome. Furthermore, they're appreciated because very often it's the wildest ideas that ultimately lead to the best solutions. Now, these guidelines are suggested by the design firm IDEO, which is based in Silicon Valley. And many of the members of the IDEO team are also faculty members at the D School. So there's a close connection between the D School and IDEO. IDEO is a fabulous design firm, and they've done some great work all around the world in product design as well as in product strategy. Now, how do we compare the stage gate with design thinking. We can think of StageGate as a disciplined technique for portfolio and project optimization. It's technical and managerial, and in that sense, somewhat like a science, whereas design thinking is a disciplined technique for idea and innovation optimization, and it relies more on the creative, on the inspirational, and therefore it's a bit like an art. But as I discussed in earlier chapters in the strategy module, innovation requires the merger, the synthesis, the integration of science and art. And so we see that the StageGate process and the design thinking process are entirely complementary. They work together beautifully, and they reflect both aspects of the mindset which are necessary and important for success and innovation. They're both disciplined. One is around the portfolio, one is around the ideas. One is around projects, one is about innovations. They're both focused on optimization. One is technical, one is creative. And of course, we realize that the integration of the StageGate and design thinking will lead us to the best results in our innovation system. So to conclude with where we started, innovation requires a mindset shift. It requires us to see the world differently. And design thinking is a tool or a method or a technique to facilitate that, to enable that, to make it easier for us to achieve these insights, a rigorous and disciplined process, which is nevertheless open-ended and creative, a powerful and fabulous tool that's an essential part of the innovation process. I want to close this chapter with a couple of further thoughts on design thinking. First of all, I want to point out that there are a lot of different versions of the design thinking process. The version that we prefer was developed by an industrial designer and design thinking expert named Hani Bajaj, who became an industrial engineer in India and then went on to study in the graduate program of the Media Lab at MIT. Although Hani was not a student at Stanford, she was a member of the team that worked on the Embrace product. And she wrote up a story about Embrace, which we included in one of our recent books called The Innovation Formula. That story is included in the package of information which you can download for this chapter. There are many fine books on design thinking. One of the best is available as a free download from the MJV consulting firm's website. So you may want to download it and take a look at it if you're interested in another perspective on design thinking. As I mentioned, in the following chapters, we'll look in more detail at the immerse, the invent, and the implement phases to provide you with more specific tools and techniques in each of these three stages of the design thinking process.